Hello, we're back for another lesson today. We're going to talk about metabolism part 1. Energy and life. Now, chemical energy, also known as ATP, energy is essential to life for many reasons. We must produce it from our environment, we must store it for future use, and we must use it in a controlled manner so that we don't run out. Active transport, cell division, production of proteins, all require energy. And we use the chemical form called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Now that tri is going to mean that we have 3 phosphates. It's composed of adenosine, a ribose sugar, and those 3 phosphates. It is quick energy, and the energy is located in the chemical bonds right here between the phosphates. So adenosine diphosphate, di means what? Oh, 2. So it's only going to have 2 phosphates. And when we take adenosine diphosphate and add another phosphate to it, it becomes adenosine triphosphate. When the chemical bonds are broken, it releases the energy for many functions to occur. So when we look down here, we have high energy bonds. We have hydrolysis, which breaks it, creating water. And we have energy as it's broken. ATP is used by the cell to fuel the cellular function. ATP can only store enough energy for a few seconds, so it is created and then readily used. But long-term storage is done by using sugars, creating glucose or glycogen or starches. They can store up to 90% more energy than one single ATP, so it's more efficient to store them in something that can be stored long term. Energy in glucose is then converted into ATP when needed by the cell. So, ADP, and we add a phosphate, and we have to apply energy, creates this quick, high-energy molecule that can then go off and be broken and be used in some sort of function. Plants must trap the energy from sunlight and store it in the form of ATP. Now then they take that and then convert it into sugars. Now it must be into stored energy because it's not light out all the time, so we can't use the light reaction to create ATP all the time. We must store it somewhere, and we store it during the dark reaction. So photosynthesis equation is the process by which the plant uses energy from the sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide into high-energy carbohydrates, sugars and starches, and oxygen. Plants usually convert the sugars into starches. We, as animals, turn it into glycogen. So we take 6 carbon dioxide and 6 waters, and we use light, less chlorophyll in the chloroplast, that's going to be in plants, and we create glucose, 6C6H12O6, plus 6 oxygen. Now, light and pigments. In addition to the water and the carbon dioxide, like I said, we need light and chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a pigment inside of the chloroplast, and it absorbs a certain wavelength. They typically like to absorb reds and oranges and blues and violets, leaving the green alone. That allows the green to reflect off, and that is why we see the green in the plant, because the green wavelength is not absorbed. Again, seeing here, chlorophyll A and B absorb the violet and blue, and the red and orange, and the green can be reflected so that we can see the green. That is why plants are green. Let's check out the reactions. Inside the chloroplast, we have the thylakoid. It's a sac-like photosynthetic membrane. It is one of our coins. It is where the photosystem's collection, so it's the photosystem light collection unit, and the stacks are called the granum, or the grana. Inside, between the granum, is going to be the fluid surroundings known as the stroma. Now the light reaction occurs in the thylakoid, and the dark reaction occurs in the stroma. So again, we have 2 different types of reactions. The light-dependent reaction must occur during the daytime, during the light. takes place in the thylakoid membrane and must use light. The Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction, or the dark reaction, takes place in the stroma, and it produces the glucose. If we look at our chemical equation, we can see that the dark reaction uses the 6CO2 to create the sugar, and the light reaction uses the water to create the oxygen at the end. Electron carriers. The sunlight comes in and excites these electrons in the chlorophyll, and they're just so excited. They're just so excited. They gained a lot of energy, and they must do something. Well, they are passed from one electron carrier to the next, to the next, to the next, sort of like hot potato. And this process of transporting it is known as the electron transport, and each carrier that catches the potato and tosses it on is going to be known as the electron transport chain. Now if we look at the light-dependent reaction, like I said, there are going to be two different phases of this, but we use water, CO2, light, ADP, and NADPH, which are low-energy molecules. And we create out of this oxygen, ATP, and NADPH, which are high-energy molecules. Now remember, this occurs in the thylakoid, or the coins inside the chloroplast. Photosystem number 2 is first. Yes, I know it's backwards, but that's what happens. Photosystem 2 is first. Water splits during hydrolysis. Hydro meaning water, lysis meaning to cut. And it creates 2 electrons, 2 H+ ions, and 1 oxygen atom. The oxygen leaves the cell. The H+, or the protons, hang out in the thylakoid to be used later. Now these electrons, the chlorophyll absorbs the light energy and energizes or excites the electrons from hydrolysis. Now those excited electrons are then passed through the electron transport chain, and each time they are passed to the next electron carrier, they lose a little bit of energy, and a proton or a hydrogen ion is pumped into the thylakoid, comes from the stroma into the thylakoid. This creates a proton gradient, also known as the proton motive force. It is a difference in the concentration of protons on the inside than on the outside. So there are going to be more on the inside than there are on the outside. Now, ATP formation occurs when these H+ ions on the inside pass through a proton called the ATP synthase. Synthase sort of sounds like synthesize, which means to create. That's actually what it means. The ATP synthase creates ATP. So their energy is converted, helps to convert the ADP into ATP. 3 hydrogens going through the ATP synthase will give it enough energy to create 1 ATP. So let's look at this, and don't worry, we'll be drawing this in class as well. Water is split into the oxygen, into the H+, or the protons here, that come over here and just chill, and our 2 electrons. The sunlight comes in, hits the chlorophyll P60, and the electrons go from the ground state, which is their normal state, to a high excited state, and they must do something. They must do something. So, they jump from carrier to carrier, the electron carriers, and every time they jump, we see another proton come into the thylakoid from the stroma. So as it jumps here, one comes in. As it jumps here, another comes in. As it jumps here, another comes in. And then it gets tired. But we have all of these protons, or these hydrogens, inside the thylakoid. Well, we can take 3 of them, push them out through an ATP synthase, and create 1 ATP. So we've created some energy. Now this tired electron, we're not done with him. He actually goes through now photosystem number 1. So the chlorophyll P70 uses light to re-energize the electron from photosystem number 2. So it's all excited again. It's got to do something, and so it's going to move through the electron transport chain again, losing energy, and bringing in those hydrogen ions, or those protons. And at the end, the NADP picks up that high energy electron and takes one of those hydrogen ions, combines it to make a hydrogen atom, and tacks it on. And now it becomes NADPH, a high energy molecule. Now again, those hydrogen ion movement from the inside of the thylakoid fills up positively charged, and then they can exit through that ATP synthase protein again, creating ATP. So again, now we're looking over here. Our electron from photosystem number 2 comes and gets energized by the P700 chlorophyll to this excited state, jumps with the electron carriers, and protons are pumped inside. And then the electron plus one of the protons comes together to form this hydrogen. The hydrogen is then added to the NADP to create NADPH, a high energy molecule. So we've seen we created ATP from our protons moving through ATPase to create ATP, and then we've created NADPH. Earlier we saw this oxygen leaving the cell for good and saying bye-bye. So what did we create? Oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. So we used water, ADP, which is the low energy form of ATP, and NADP+, which is the low energy form of NADPH, to create oxygen and the high energy forms, ATP and NADPH. So we're done with the light cycle. Now that only happens during the day when there's light. Now we hit the Calvin cycle or the dark reaction. Calvin cycle uses those ATPs and NADPH created from the light reaction to create sugars. It occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast and does not require light. Again, ATP and NADPH, these high energy molecules, are not stable enough to store for a long term. So we must create sugars so that we can store the energy for a long time. We take carbon dioxide, the ATP, and the NADPH, and we produce glucose, which we can then store for a very long time. So again, in the Calvin cycle, we take our 6 carbon dioxide, we use our ATP, we use our NADPH, and we produce glucose. So overall, when we're talking about the light reaction, we use H2O. We use ADP, the low energy form, and then ADP+, which are the low energy forms. And we use sunlight, we excite that electron, we split the water, and we get oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. This ATP and NADPH, combined with CO2 and more water, goes through the Calvin cycle to create glucose. And then these low energy forms can then go back in to the light reaction. So it's sort of like a whole cycle, ultimately ending with what we want, which is glucose for long-term storage. Factors that affect photosynthesis: temperature affects photosynthesis, and availability of water. Desert plants must adapt to survive with little bits of water. They have waxy leaves, and they can modify photosynthesis to preserve their water and only do it at certain times. During the cold months, conifers may occasionally carry out photosynthesis because they still have their needles on them so that they can still gain some energy and some sugar. All this talk about sugar makes me hungry. I just wish I could just step outside and get some sugar, but I can't. See you later.